Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On this bright sunny morning, we discuss today what getting published in Europe and UK means, and how different it is from the process in India. The personal journey of some of the authors of these countries and interesting snippets they can share with the Indian writers. Tilman Rammstedt has received many awards, including the renowned Ingeborg Bachmann and Annette von Droste Hulshof Literary Prizes. Their Kaiser von China, the King of China, won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2008, is translated into English by Siegel Books, Kolkata. Rammstedt's other well-known work include Erle Gungen, For Their Fire, Wir bleiben in der Nähe, and many more. Tilman Rammstedt is also Goethe Writer-in-Resident at the Bangalore Literature Festival in 2013, September. Now, I would like to introduce Mr. Ian Jack, a Scottish journalist who was the editor of the literary magazine Granta from 1995 to 2007. Educated in Dunfermline High School and worked on several newspapers in Scotland as a reporter, editor, feature writer, and foreign correspondent in India. A contributor to The Guardian for many years and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2009 and many more. We also have Aurélia Lassaque, an Occitan and French poet keenly interested in the relationship between poetry and music, has collaborated with musicians for numerous music and poetry shows. In 2010, she was artistic director of the Festival of European and Mediterranean Minority Literatures held in Italy. Moderating this session is an eminent luminary of the Indian publishing industry, Karthika V. Karthika is the publisher and chief editor of HarperCollins Publisher, India. I welcome you all, sir, madam.
So we start with the English release of the English edition of The King of China. So maybe we can unwrap the copies.
Oh, so I should hide this one. I didn't know. So this here. Oh, I didn't know. That's. Okay. Do I have to do it in a special way? Okay. I've never seen it before. Can you hold that?
Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to launch Tilman's new book, The Emperor of China, Der Kaiser von China.
Yeah, I'm very, very, very pleased with this translation, with the cover and the design. I have to admit, as you all saw, that I saw it yesterday already. It actually is a brilliant translation, I have to say. I have to thank Katie Derbyshire for doing the translation. The only thing I just found out this morning is that I dedicated the original version to my wife, and she misspelled her name. I will run into problems when I'm home. I said, who is this woman?
So we thought that since we're a very diverse group of people here, one a poet, one a novelist, one a literary editor and writer, we thought maybe we should just start with some readings. So he could read from King of China. I think Aurélia is happy to read some poetry to us. Let's start the day with a reading, and then we'll talk about the different aspects of writing and publishing in Europe.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I can. I only need. I'm not gesturing a lot. I'll read just like two and a half pages near the beginning. Just some words on the book. It's a pack of lies. You shouldn't believe anything or anyone in this book, least of all the narrator. It's a young man in his early 20s, and he's supposed to go on a journey to China with his grandfather, who's also kind of a father figure for him. But that doesn't work out because he loses the travel money in a casino. He kind of stumbles into a marriage with the ex-girlfriend of his grandfather, and he hides under the desk in order not to go to China, the grandfather leaves alone, but right at the beginning of the journey, the grandfather dies. So the narrator has a lot of problems. He tries to cover up these problems by writing letters to his siblings, pretending that he is in China with the grandfather. And he's describing China in great detail, even though he's never been there, and I've never been there. So we share that. And the only source is a Lonely Planet travel guide and his imagination. And in the beginning of the description, the Lonely Planet guide is a big, has the bigger influence. At the end, him and me, we kind of forgot about the travel guide and made it up all ourselves. And I just read a little bit on the beginning, which is not in China yet, but it's just describing his family situation a little bit. I'm not sure how many of my brothers and sisters I'm actually related to, but I can safely assume that I share at least one parent with most of them. I can still vaguely remember my younger sister being born. I was 4 at the time, and all of us went to visit my mother in hospital. "There you all are," she called out in a voice still a little weak, but it later became clear that she had to think about my second eldest brother's name for a long time, and she kept looking at my elder sister very tentatively, as well as if she wasn't quite sure if she'd seen her before somewhere. So I can only infer that that woman in the hospital was my biological mother, but apart from biology, we didn't have much to do with each other at the time. I lived with my grandfather from a very early age, whereby I can only infer that he's my biological grandfather, of course. There's a certain similarity between him and my mother, their chins, their short fingers, that would just have to suffice. He always evaded any more detailed questioning. Once I found a photograph of him as a young man with a girl on his shoulders, and I asked if the girl was my mother. He took the photo, gave it a glance with his eyes screwed up, and then handed it back to me and said, "Probably." My grandfather thought many things were probable. That we had milk in the fridge, that the summer holidays were coming soon, that the water went down the plug hole the other way round in Australia. He holed himself up in his probabilities. You could never be quite sure of anything at all, he taught us. And if one of us piped up with a contradiction, "Except that you'll die," he'd add, "That is indeed very probable." But he seemed to see a tiny chance of even that not happening, and in the past months, since his body had been catching up on its age-appropriate decline, he had clutched at that tiny chance with a perseverance I'd never known he had. His ambition not to die had gradually become a full-blown obsession. Every few days we had to accompany him to the cemetery, where he paced along the graves with triumphant exclamations of "younger, much younger, and almost the same age." And if anyone had had the temerity to die at a mature age, he noted down the precise dates, which he then copied into the list above his desk. 79 years, 282 days, 81 years, 6 days, 88 years, 129 days. He'd overtaken some of the people on the list in the past few months, crossed out a few more names, and then he gathered us all up. "Congratulations, grandfather," we chanted, but he waved away our wishes. "Thank you, but I've not achieved anything yet." His wish to outlive everyone else soon began to take alarming forms. Death was not only his adversary, it also became his helpmeet. He would read out the death notices with relish over breakfast. He'd gaze hopefully after every ambulance that drove past. He developed a suspicious penchant for disaster movies, and it was only at the last moment that we prevented him from burying my younger sister's tortoise in the garden at one afternoon. It was clinically dead, honestly, he claimed, ignoring the tortoise's legs struggling visibly in the barely ankle-deep pit. There were moments in the past few months when we were seriously concerned for our safety. If one of us as much as coughed, my grandfather instantly pricked up his ears. "That doesn't sound good." And it wasn't worry that resonated in his voice. I'm not sure whether I was imagining it, but the suspicious incidents came more and more often. He kept topping up my elder brother's wine glass, even when he'd stress he had to drive. My elder sister reported scratch marks on her hairdryer cable, and as I was carrying a crate of mineral water down the steep staircase to the cellar a few months ago, my grandfather suddenly turned off the light. "Sorry," he said when I shouted a complaint up the stairs, but he didn't turn the light back on. It was around this time that my grandfather began accusing me and my brothers and sisters of being after his blood. There was constantly something wrong with his medication, he claimed. We were constantly putting butter in his food, although he was supposed to watch his cholesterol. Someone was constantly opening the window to make him catch his death. "But it won't work on me, my dears," he'd say, "not me, oh no." My grandfather did know, of course, that he very probably wasn't immortal and never would be, despite all his efforts and precautions. I suspect he was stubbornly hoping to get too old to die one day, to be at some point simply forgotten by death, The way you hope the telephone company will forget you once you've ignored all their bills and final demands, and the telephone line simply goes on working because no one knows someone is still using it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the process of translation? You're clearly very, very, sort of good with English. So how does that work? Because you're clearly also part of the translation process then.
No, thank God not. Thanks a lot for the English. But of course, as a non-native speaker, you would never be able to translate, I would say. So I'm very thankful that a native speaker did the task. And she had surprisingly little questions, and then so I was a little dubious, and I only saw the translation after it was already in print. But she did a wonderful job, and it's like the first translation of my books I could actually check. I mean, when I see like an Hungarian or Korean translation, I can just glance at it and say, yeah, probably done it very well. But I've no idea. I heard actually that with Korea translates a lot of German literature, and not only fiction, but also non-fiction. And I heard of one friend who wrote a non-fiction book with some graphics in it. And then he looked at his Korean translation and found graphics that were not in the original. But he had no idea what they meant. So.
And this has never happened to you?
No, I don't use graphics. And actually, I've never seen my Korean translation. I heard that it exists, and I asked for my copies, but somehow they were never sent to me.
So what is it that you think makes your work so translatable around the world in so many languages? Is there something that you can pinpoint?
Well, I mean, I'm translated in some languages, but I'm not translated all over the world. And I think I guess on the one hand, my books are understandable in a lot of countries, cultures, a little bit. I would say that at least parts of it. Or I had one reading here already from the book, and of course I was a little nervous if this book would work in India, and I was very glad that everybody said, "Okay, you're actually writing about my grandfather." So I guess grandfathers are more or less the same all over the world. It's normally in Germany it's easier for you to get translated if you write either about the war or about the GDR. These are the topics everybody kind of expects from us, especially in English translation. It's nearly impossible to get without any of these two topics. Because you would probably say that, but I don't know about the exact number. It's like 1% of the English literary market is translations, and I think in Germany it's about like 60%. No, that's probably exaggerated, but it's but on the one hand it's true. I mean, you can always say, yeah, but we have something similar without translating it. So why should we do it?
Yes. Well, you're right about Britain's fascination with the war. Less so with East Germany, but certainly with the war. It's difficult to think of a country more obsessed with the Second World War than Britain is. Can you hear me? No? Is that better? Sorry. I'm just saying it's difficult to think of a country more interested in the Second World War than Britain is. And but W.G. Sebald is translated from the German into English.
Yeah, but he lived there for a long time.
Yes, but he's a big success. He kind of contradicts.
Much bigger success than in Germany. He's in Britain.
Yeah. Sorry, that's okay.
Yeah. No, you did talk about this earlier, and you said, I wonder if it makes the writing any different, knowing that you're writing for not just your immediate market, but for readers other places?
Well, this was in the context of Indian writers, really. One time, perhaps still, but perhaps much less so now, the kind of seal of approval for an Indian writer came from London or New York. One was thought to be taken seriously in these places and to be taken seriously here if you were published there. And I've often wondered if that had an effect on the writing in the sense of audience. If you think you're writing for this thing called a global audience, do you write differently from writing for an Indian audience? I'm not sure there's an answer to this question, but it used to used to think about it. I mean, Omid Chowdhury, for instance, the Calcutta writer, was very insistent that if he wrote Chowringi in a piece for Granta, which I then edited, that nobody said Chowringi, comma, the famous street or the shopping street or the main street in Calcutta. He didn't want to give the reader any more help than he used to say, well, nobody helped me to understand Yeats, his poetry, by adding little lines here and there, saying what the lake isle was in Innisfree and so on. And I could understand that. At the same time, I noticed that when he went to the New Yorker, that when Amit had a piece of the New Yorker, being published in the New Yorker was so important that, in fact, they did put in things like, Calcutta's famous Chowringi, I think may have been a line there. So clearly he was responding to pressure from America that was greater than my pressure from Granta. But I think it is a difficult thing, that, both in terms of translation and in terms of audience. And I just wonder, I don't know, Karthika, you would know more about this than I do probably, but I just wondered if Indian writers were somehow writing for a different audience in those days. Difficult to know.
I don't know that either, but maybe we can talk about that, including the audience later, which has a lot of Indian writers, one in front of us, so we can talk about that. But I wonder if one of the most difficult things I imagine to translate should be humor. I mean, something like this is funny for all of us in English. I have no idea what the impact of it would be in German.
In Germany, nobody laughs about this. It's a very serious book. I'm a little insulted also that you all laugh. I will leave now.
Are you insulted because we laughed? Or okay, so maybe we can move to some poetry now. And Aurélia, will you read us some and talk about it a little bit?
Oh, it's okay, thank you. So I will read always the English translation, and I write bilingually in French and Occitan. The original historical language of the half south of France, Latin language.
Do you mind reading the original as well? It's just
of course, always, yeah. I did some readings 2 days ago here. Maybe some people have heard it already. De sa maire beget lulach, de sa fenno manchet la car, de sus drolles cremet lu cervels, Praco, cumprem passa suleso. Sonustal beu la prieccio, sattero engulis las peiros, demurarà l'urei dell'istorio che cunto, es lu privilegi des mustres da Isabel. He drank the milk of his mother, he ate the flesh of his wife, and burned the brains of his children. Yet he can't fathom his feeling alone. His house laps up the rain, his land gorges on stones. He'll always be king in the story he tells. That's the privilege of monsters here below. La negresso sumiabo di rancis ruccis redundes. Miral vegetal de sas puppos reguleggiantos de la snow. Li nascet un drolle del pel russet des juels verds, que serbabo en secreti sino banasto de frutos falsos. A black woman dreamed of round red oranges, a pulpy mirror of her breast dripping new milk. She bore a boy with russet hair and green eyes. In secret she kept him in a basket of false fruits. In French. Tu as pris le chemin du pays de nuit. Le désert y est de gel, et les étoiles s'ennuient. Ouvre tes bras et creuse. La poussière sera ton pain. Tu t'abreuveras de nos larmes. Va, va et ne te retourne pas. Si tu entends hurler la pierre, c'est qu'on y grave les lettres de ton nom. You've chosen the path for the land of night. The desert is made of ice there, and the stars die of boredom. Stretch out your arms and dig. Dust will be your bread. You'll swallow hard tears. Go now. Go. And don't return. If you hear the stones wailing, the letters of your name are being engraved. Last one. All'uro del solstici, lu pople vestit de fusto, a tiro di sarammo da usel sencaro. L'uriru barullaire careccio discas rivals sus remembres de neu. Lus aubres de masselbo enruquechat al primi gior de l'estiu. Lus hommes de la billo andicca cos la rubilio e che mel del Giappun. Mas ele sabun pas que lus aubres da querucumbo, di nus secret de los rasigos, alison de peiros vivos, que se metu a sumia que l'auro e la plueccio las prendran nuso sul bar all'uro del solstici. At the solstice hour, people dressed in wood lure into their leafage birds without faces. The wandering stream drags towards the shores its memories of snow. My sylvan trees have reddened with summer's first day. The man from the town said that was rust blown in from Japan. But they don't know that the trees in this comb, in their deepest secret roots, stroke living stones that start to dream that the wind and the rain will take them naked on clay at the solstice hour.
We spoke earlier of why and how poetry continues to be published, and I think there can be no better reason than just listening to this poetry. It was stunning, thank you. Will you tell us a little bit about that process of writing, publishing poetry in Europe, what it's like, and the spaces where you get to publish poetry? You do a lot of work with journals, I think. You publish in journals as well?
No,
as
indeed,
books?
I publish in collections,
Okay.
and not that much in journals and review, because but it's a choice, because I think if you spread, if you spread too much poems on different reviews, and in the end, when you have your book, so I prefer to keep it for collections.
And how do you relate to your readers? I mean, do they come to you? Do they?
So in France, we have readers of poetry. People like it, and we have an event called Le Printemps des Poètes, so Spring of Poets, and during 1 month in March, there are hundreds events all over the country dedicated to poetry. We have Le Marché de la Poésie, the Market of Poetry. It's in June, and we have like 150 or 200 publishers together. And something very different in France, if we compare to Anglophone countries, to India, it's that our poetry publishers are specialized in poetry. My English publisher, he does a lot of historical books, prose, etc. It was for me it was strange, but now I see that it's more common to publish poetry amongst other things in other countries. But in France, we have a tradition of publishing poetry.
And is it just France, or are there other countries in Europe that have this similar tradition? In Germany, what about Germany?
Well, I mean, I think we do have a vivid poetic scene with poems and publishers that specialize in poems. Of course, they they suffer because I'm not sure about. Or yeah, they do it out of passion. I'm not sure if more people in France buy poetry. In Germany, I think everybody likes poetry, but nobody's buying it. And so it's. I mean, there are other ways, but I'm not a poet. But I think since we have a very vivid young poetry scene, I mean, they do get noticed because there are a lot of festivals specialized on poetry. There are lots of events, small publications, and some of them are published at the big publishing houses. They kind of have this luxury of having some volumes of poetry. But even that you have to. My publisher used to do that. And everybody loved them for publishing poetry in a very beautiful way. But they stopped it after a while because they couldn't afford it anymore. Apparently, so it is difficult. Even it's done, but it's difficult.
Yeah, that's why I can talk about. This is the French collection. I mean, it's always bilingual, so it's Occitan and French. But I think this publisher is a model for publishing poetry because, like in every country, it is a gender that sells less than prose, fiction, etc. Normally, the number of copies, when a publisher does one collection, is around 500. And I have discovered that in many countries, no matter the size of the country, it's around 500 copies.
I heard this number from Germany too also, even though France and Germany are quite close.
That's how it works. He decided to treat poetry as any other gender. So he never published less than 1,200 books. And some of them are 3,000 copies, always. Because he decided to work with a distributor called Harmonia Mundi, who has, the books are in all bookshops. Okay. It costs a lot to him because he gives a big part of... But people buy it and people read it and it works. So I think the poetry publishers, they should, in a way, trust a little bit more in poetry, because...
Can I draw you in, Ian?
Surely. Well, I mean, in Britain, poetry is no more liked than it is in France or Germany, I guess. Although, having said that, I mean, Faber and Faber, by publishing Ted Hughes and Larkin and Seamus Heaney, which poets who sold in enormous numbers and made a lot of money for Faber and Faber. And also they published T.S. Eliot. And in fact, it was T.S. Eliot's poem Cats, which was adapted into a musical, which still plays somewhere in some city all over the world, that made Faber's fortune, really. And that's in the last 20, 30 years. So poetry can have kind of odd consequences. I mean, it has a life beyond the printed page sometimes. And, I mean, for Heaney to win the Nobel Prize is a big thing for Faber. I edited Grant's magazine. I was the editor-in-chief of the books at Grant's as well for a while. And we never published poetry. At least very rarely did we publish poetry. Only by mistake, once or twice, did we publish poetry in Grant's magazine. One was with Vikram Seth. That was a disaster because we published I don't know how this happened. It's a shameful story, but he wrote a little poem about an Indian mythological, an Indian god, I suppose. I can't remember his name now. He was a very minor character in Indian mythology. And one of us, I'm just kind of shirking the blame here a little bit, one of us wrote a little introductory paragraph before the poem and then put the poem in the magazine. Well, Vikram Seth, I've never really talked to him much since, but he wrote a letter of such fury that we had to publish the poem again, minus the introductory paragraph. So we published Vikram Seth's poem twice. And after that, we never published any poetry.
What did the introduction say?
It just explained who this figure was in the poem. Perhaps it was an example of something we kind of touched on earlier, which was that if something needs explanation, perhaps just ask the person to go away and find out, rather than printing a little paragraph. Anyway, there it was. So we never really published poetry.
When was this?
This was 1997. I can even remember the month,
Right.
if that helps.
You know, it might be fun to just draw the audience in right away. So if you have any questions, comments, you want to talk poetry, get them to read a little bit more, I think we should just do whatever you feel like. What do you think? Is that okay? Yeah. How do you get published in Europe?
Well, first of all, you have to write a book, I guess. No, it's. I don't think it's. I don't think it's very different. I don't know. I've been to some, listened to some panel discussions here, and I always had the feeling that they could actually be more or less exactly like the literary ones. They could have been in Germany too. The same. I don't know. The same questions, the same answers, the same problems, the same vanities, the same despair, whatever. I don't know. It's well, actually, I was wrong with saying that you have to write a book first. It's actually probably the worst thing you can do is to write a book first, because this most definitely will be a waste of time if you only write it to get published, because you will never get published in Germany, and I don't think it was anywhere else in Europe. Probably not. That you just send your book to the publisher, he reads it, loves it, and publishes it. They get I don't know how many hundred books a day, and some intern reads them, and or the editors read them with a frown on the face. It's the same in India, I see. Yeah. So basically, you have the publisher, the editors. They need to know you for some reason. We do have agencies in Germany. They're not as powerful as in the States or in Britain, but that's one way that an agent recommends you, or you published in a magazine. You won a minor award for unpublished authors. You've been to a creative writing school, which we do have in Germany more and more. Like we have like 2 bigger ones and a couple of minor ones. So I guess most of the first books that are published in Germany are by authors that were somehow heard of before.
And if you extend that question to, can you also talk about how you might get published in Europe from one language to the other, or Britain to Europe, etc.?
Well, just on the thing that Tilman has just said.
He asked, how do you get published in Europe? So that's the answer.
I mean, one of the great paradoxes of publishing, I think, is that the person given the most important job in the office is the least qualified person to do it. And that is reading the slush pile. The slush pile is what you call unsolicited manuscripts. That is manuscripts that have just come through the post to you. And in granted, it used to be about 100 documents a week. And they would be given to the person who just joined the company, who would read them. I mean, reading 100 things a week is quite a lot to ask anybody. And of course, it never got read fully. It mounted up, so you would get, there'd be kind of geological layers of slush going down to the Cambrian age. And this was kind of wrong, because sometimes slush piles do contain things worth publishing. And of course, we were lucky and we had good people, actually, young as they were, to read them. But actually, I should have been reading them, and I think it's often the case that publishing delegates this matter. I mean, I know that slush piles are often a waste of time, but sometimes there are things in them. And that's probably a way not to get published. The way to get published, I think, is what Tilman has said, probably write a book, but not necessarily write a book. Get an agent and tell her you're going to write a book. Write 2,000 words on what the book will be about. Make the agent impressed with the idea you can actually write it, and then let her sell it to a publisher. That sometimes works.
About poetry, I was talking about publishing poetry in an event called Publishing Next. It was in Goa. And I discovered that in India, it's quite common and normal to ask the poet to give money. Or the poet, it's a kind of auto-publishing, or not everywhere, but self-publishing. But someone told me, yes, we do it. It's something. And I was talking with a Turkish poet who was telling me, I would like to be published in France, I can pay for it. And I said, never say that to a French publisher, because yes, maybe in some countries that's a way to be published, in poetry, because people think it doesn't sell. So if you want to be published, you have. But self-publishing in France is not considered.
So tell us about self-publishing in Europe generally. I mean, there's lots of talk here about people just getting on Amazon, being published, and not requiring editors or publishers. Is that the same there? Is that the way the conversation is going?
Yeah, I mean, 50 Shades of Grey came that route, and it sometimes works. I mean, my daughter, I think I said this yesterday, but nonetheless, I'll say it again. I mean, she's 21. There's a whole bunch of people around that age who choose the things they read. They read them digitally on a Kindle, and they choose them because they're like other things they've read. It's, if you like this, you'll like this. So it's not a very kind of mind-expanding thing, I would think. Nonetheless, it's very, very common. And self-publishing, it's a very odd thing, this really. At Granta, going back to Granta again, people would often write family memoirs, which were interesting documents. But to feel validated about having written them, they wanted to be published with a capital P in a London publishing house. But actually, often these things would have been better off just as family documents, privately published digitally. And there is this still, I think there's still this kind of, not really snobbery, I wouldn't know what to call it, but the idea that getting published by Faber and Faber, Jonathan Cape, Random House, Penguin, now the same thing, is a very important thing to do. HarperCollins, an important thing to do. And I can understand that, but it's a great shame because I think a lot of things deserve a circulation or readership that will never go through that process because there isn't the money for them. They'll lose money, in fact, almost certainly.
That's true. Can I ask a writer in the audience to ask her a question?
No, it was actually a response to what Ian had raised, the issue of translation in for Indian writers, whether you actually change when you're writing for an audience abroad. And I was just going through a lot of my old books by era, and I noticed that the glossary died a long time ago for Indian writing in English, but there was a time when it was absolutely common. You assumed, I think 40 years ago, if you were going to be published abroad, that you would have to translate that in the context that was part of your job. And these days, I think while the demand is still there, I had one of my German translator actually asked whether he could change the names of the feline characters in the book to make them less Indian and more German-friendly. And I said, yeah, I mean, if you want to change the names of Rudolph and the rest of the reindeers back to we're fine. And thankfully, he saw the funny side of that, and we settled that little argument. But by and large, I think Indian writers seem to be, in English, more confident about saying we'd rather not translate the context. Indian bestseller writers here don't even have to because their audiences are here. And it's not the same, though, for Indian writers in other regional languages, because I think there we still have a double standard in India, and that worries me a little bit. The assumption is that if somebody writes in a language outside of English, it's okay to ask them to translate words, phrases, contexts. And I sometimes wonder about that with some unease, just to raise that point.
Anybody in the audience has a question? Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you mentioned that in Germany, pretty much most of the writing you would expect is about war. Is there something similar about UK or France that audiences generally expect in your writing?
Just one thing to clarify here: it's the expectation from foreign publishers. it's not. I mean, only a minority. I mean, most of the books in Germany are not about the war. It's just that it's a good argument for translation. Yep.
It's a bit like how they expect Indian writing to be a bit exotic and, pastoral and beautiful.
A little bit mythology and stuff
A
like
little
that.
bit.
Not too much, please.
Not too much.
I suppose sex is a general thing that we believe sells books. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But I can't think of, outside the Second World War, which is a kind of almost mythical thing in Britain, I can't think of any single thing that sells books.
Grandfathers, maybe.
I mean, no, it's sad because the books that are sold, which sell, there are. I have noticed that there are more and more, people's biography, like politics and celebrity biographies, and a lot of those books are
But maybe
have success.
maybe it's more interesting to ask from the other countries. Like, for example, I think if you buy a book by a British author in Germany, you would expect it to be like cultured, sophisticated, and with this infamous British humor, which nobody actually knows what it is, but it's a big thing in Germany. And with the French, it has to be like charming, probably a little sexy. That's what we want from French literature. I mean, just to assure you.
P.J. Wodehouse, is he big in Germany?
Well,
I mean,
he's
he was big in 1940 in Germany, but perhaps that's too long.
He's a little bit like poetry. Everybody pretends to have read him, but nobody has.
Anybody else? Comment, question? Shall we ask? There is someone there.
This question is very specific to translating poetry. How much of a decision do you get to make on who translates your poetry? Because the reason I ask is I've not read international languages, but when I read any of the Indian languages and the translation of it, I think there's a beauty in the language that's lost in translation. So do you really get to choose who translates your work?
This is the
Thank you.
big matter. For this English translation, the translator reads French and Occitan. So I knew that he was totally capable to read both original languages, because I have to say that I write bilingually. I don't translate myself into French or into Occitan. The original text is bilingual. So then I wanted to respect the translator, like what I do when I work with artists, visual artists. They ask me, do you like it? I mean, if I don't like it, I say it, but if it's his own creation, So I wanted to respect the English translator, and I just did some comments, and sometimes he agreed, sometimes not. And that's how it worked. I think this is very British. But, I mean, the important thing is people to like it in the country where it's published. It has to be close, of course. It has to translate my words. But that's why also I wanted him to be free, because I spoke about some of his choice with poets who are not English, but they are bilingual with English, but they are Turkish or Israeli, etc. And they said, oh no, I think it's the same verses. They said, oh no, it's not what you wrote. Like, I can give you an example. Thunder rumbles like Titanic laughter. What I wrote is like the laugh of a Titan. Bon, I thought it's not the same image, but maybe, I don't know, maybe.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I, because you read so beautifully, and because French is to an English person the language of tra-la, and so on, love and romance. It sounds terrific in French in a way that it doesn't sound in English, but perhaps that's impossible to render it. I mean, just a little story here. In the early 80s in Calcutta, I used to go every day to the East Indian Railway office in Old Court Street next to the Great Eastern Hotel. And because there was a PR there who was going to get me on a special journey by train, which he never did. But for several lunchtimes, I would go and meet him, and he would be a collection of Bengali poets meeting him at the same time, doing nothing but eating toast and rashgulla for lunch. And one of them, of course, was several were great Tagore enthusiasts. And this man said something to me one day, which I thought was a very, very good little simile. He said, poetry in translation is like embroidery from the back. And that seemed to me very true. And I was repeating that story to Gulzar Sahib, who's at this festival, and he came up with a better one, actually, although quite sexist, I have to say, if you'll excuse me saying this. He said, that's good, he said, but we say translated poetry is like a mistress. When beautiful, not faithful. When faithful, not beautiful.
Exactly. And that's why I really respect his work. Even if sometimes I doubt, he is the hand who translates the old book. So it has to be balanced in his hand. So, and for the languages, I am translated into Macedonian and Hebrew and Dutch, and I'm not capable to judge it. So and in German, what matters for me then, when I don't understand the language, is the relationship with the translator. Maybe it's a very bad idea, but at least to feel close and...
Yeah, that sounds... yeah. This is a really naive question, but since we're talking about European publishing, how far do any of you see yourselves either as European writers, or have you ever seen yourself, Ian, as a European editor as opposed to a British editor?
Well, Britain's a funny place, as you know, so it has a slightly kind of distant relationship with what's still called the continent. So I train myself to believe myself to be a European. I would like to be a European. I would like to be more interested in European literature than I seem to be. The truth is that actually very little European literature is successfully translated in Britain. Having said that, the amazing success of Scandinavian crime fiction in English is a stunning, stunning thing, and nobody could have predicted that. It was due to a guy called Christopher McElhose, who was a publisher, and he believed, it's a good example of belief in something, he believed that Scandinavian crime fiction writers were very good, and he eventually had a huge success with Stieg Larsson. So, it's London feels more akin to New York than it does to Paris or Berlin. And language has got a lot to do with that. Politics has got something to do with it as well. It's a difficult thing to get around that, I think. I have to be honest about it.
Just one thing about this this hype about Scandinavian crime fiction in the rest of Europe. There was a scandal last year where a very prominent German journalist wrote under a nom de plume, pretended to be a Swedish writer and having written a crime fiction novel in order to sell more of it. Because if he would have published it under a German name, nobody would have been interested in that. And then some journalists found out that there actually wasn't a Swedish original. And then they found out that they actually had a blurb from Orhan Pamuk on the back, which accidentally, he is a friend of this journalist. But Orhan Pamuk does neither read German nor Swedish, so that was a little suspicious. And then the journalist had to say, it's me.
What happened then?
It was very embarrassing. I mean, he's really very, very prominent figure in German market. And another one pretended to be French, actually. That wasn't a journalist, that was a publisher. He wrote under nom de plume, and it was because Germans we buy we don't read that many translations except probably for American fiction. That's probably the biggest thing. I don't think like I mean, of course, we read like Julian Barnes from England and Welbeck from France, and that's about it. But in crime stories, we like the exotic things, and Sweden is very big. But France, I mean, we only look at the cover. If there's a wooden house with a lake, then it's Swedish, and we buy it. And if it's like a rough coastside, so he gave himself a name from Brittany, which is like the rough coast. Then we buy it also. Yeah.
Any last question? We'll take one more.
I didn't answer to her question.
Oh, sure.
About seeing ourselves as European writer. That's the question. Yeah. I wouldn't say European in my case. I would say more Mediterranean. That's the way. And I think it's true because of the languages, because of cultural background. But when I travel, and I was in Norway a few weeks ago. Now I'm in India. After 2 or 3 days, I feel as if I was from this country. So yeah, the Indianization is almost complete now, so I can leave India.
I'm taking the liberty of saying we're going to close, but I'm just going to ask them to do a very short reading each, so we go away with their words from their work in our heads.
Can you start? Can you start?
Yeah,
So because I don't know what. So yeah.
Okay, I will read just 2 poems. Kind of dialogue. Lusomi d'Urfeu, ti nos infer que lus hommes sunt pa mai che d'umbros, me farai umbro al dedin de tuncos, bastirai de ciutats de saplo, cagutaran lu flunche de gunne torno, dansarenses de tures que nos resuels veiran pas, serai talengo trencado que sapamenti, e maudiren namu que nos ha perduts. The dream of Orpheus, in the underworld, where men are nothing more than shades, I'll shadow myself within your body. I'll fashion cities of sand that bleed dry the river of no return. We'll dance upon towers that our eyes cannot see. I'll be your severed tongue that tells no lies, and we'll curse the love that lost us. And Usomi di Euridicio. Cavaren d'autros regos que cubriren de cendre, beirem murilu ben carechaire tublit, aurai de pumos de mapocho raubados a mai paure que eu, las pelaren nom despasos, e am so que sobro de nostres sommis, de bastirem mai de la luz fiox e la termiero de ragazzi. The dream of Eurydice. We'll dig other furrows and fill them with ash. We'll see dying the carrier wind of oblivion. In my pocket, I'll carry apples stolen from poorer souls than me. We'll peel them with sabers. With what's left of our dreams, we'll fashion others beyond the fires and frontiers of our eyes.
Okay, I read the first of these letters this narrator sends apparently from China, but actually under his disc. And this first letter is still very, very much in the tone of the Lonely Planet guidebook, which is most of the information is copied from literally anyway. May 15th, Beijing. My dears, grandfather and I landed in Beijing yesterday after a journey of 15 hours and 25 minutes. The flight went fine despite grandfather alerting the cabin crew to alleged noises on several occasions. He didn't fall asleep until the captain had personally assured him that he was perfectly capable of flying in the dark. From Capital Airport, we then took a taxi for the 27-kilometer journey to the center, which cost approximately 85 yuan. On the way, grandfather asked the name of almost every building we passed, but the taxi driver didn't understand German, not even very loud German, and then grandfather soon gave up and kept saying, well, or there will be something or other, and chewing his nicotine gum. We're staying at the Bamboo Garden, a cozy and tranquil hotel. The staff aren't quite as helpful as we'd liked, but that has partly to do with the culture, grandfather explained. The rooms are tastefully decorated, Ming furniture, a small but clean bathroom, abundant foliage outside the window, but grandfather says the typical flair of the old city is somewhat restricted by the modern residential block directly opposite. The room cost 680 yuan, a mid-range price as we found when we made a comparison. Grandfather and I went for an evening walk around Dongcheng, that's the name of the area where we're staying, past the East Church with its large square up to the hill of Jingshan Park, from where we enjoyed the magnificent panorama of the capital and an unparalleled overview of the rusted roofing of the Forbidden City. The last of the Ming emperors is said to have hanged himself in his park as rebels swarmed at the city walls. Grandfather was very moved by this story. A couple of rebels and bam, a whole dynasty comes to an end, he said with a shake of his head. In the evening we ate out at Bagu Bui, a Sichuan restaurant as good value as it is popular, decorated in marvelous Chinese in style. The ambience was bursting with both character and theater. Grandfather chose Sakai rosy, deep-fried pork or beef fillet with brown mustard, and I decided on ganshao yan li, boiled carp with ham and sweet and spicy sauce, which grandfather preferred to his own dish, so we swapped after a few bites. The only problem was the chopsticks. They only put on all this hocus-pocus for tourists, grandfather said. No one had been eating with them for centuries. Even when I showed him that all the other diners, almost entirely Chinese, were uncomplainingly and skillfully consuming their dishes with these antediluvian implements, he waved away my objections. Tourists, he said, they're all tourists. In the end, I ordered a knife and fork for him, and every time I dropped a morsel into my bowl, he gave a mocking laugh and raised his glass. Here's to civilization. Grandfather's asleep now. I've been looking for an internet cafe, but haven't found one. Apparently, they've been closing down one after another here in Beijing, so I'm writing this by hand, and I'll send it as soon as I can. All my love, Kay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both of you. Ian, it's been a lovely conversation.